This is Jamon Bull, host of the MJCast. Before we begin, I'd just like to point out to listeners that in the middle of this episode with Jeff Margolis, there is a question that Jeff chose not to go on the record for. I have chosen to leave this question in, even though Jeff insisted we pause the recording for his response. I apologise for the disrupted nature of the discussion.
The following is a presentation from the MJCast, the internet's premier podcast on all things Michael Jackson.
I'm a Black American. I am proud of who I am.
Together, we can make a change in the world.
I want to see you!
I like to take sounds and put them on the microscope.
There's a driving bass, you become the bass. Let the music write itself.
I don't sing it if I don't mean it.
Welcome to the MJCast, your source of news, discussion and interviews on the King of Pop. Hello and welcome to the MJCast. My name's Jamon Bull and our guest today is one of the most successful live TV event directors of all time, having worked on the Oscars, the Emmys, the Golden Globes, the Screen Actors Guild Awards and the American Music Awards. His glittering career has brought him into contact with movie stars, music legends, even former presidents. He has created TV specials with the likes of Cher, Julie Andrews, Dolly Parton, Frank Sinatra, Kenny Rogers and Richard Pryor, made movies with Ringo, Starr and Quincy Jones, directed a music video for Whitney Houston. The roster of talent across his many TV projects has also included Ella Fitzgerald, Gladys Knight, Burt Bacharach, Gene Kelly, Smokey Robinson, Elton John, Lionel Richie, Prince, and the list goes on. Jeff Margolis' career saw him cross paths with Michael Jackson numerous times. In 1989, he directed Sammy Davis Jr.'s 60th anniversary special, where Michael performed a specially written tribute song called You Were There. In 1993, Jeff directed the 20th Annual American Music Awards, where Michael performed Dangerous for the very first time and won the inaugural International Artist Award, which was thereafter given annually in Michael's name. In 1995, Jeff signed on as the director of Michael's ill-fated One Night Only HBO special, which fell apart after Michael collapsed in rehearsals. 2 years later, he directed Happy Birthday, Elizabeth at the Pantages Theatre, where Michael once again performed a specially written song, Elizabeth, I Love You. Michael and Jeff would collaborate again in 2001 for the hastily assembled United We Stand concert, organised within weeks to raise funds for the victims of the 9/11 terror attack in New York City. Michael headlined the show, performing Man in the Mirror and assembling a glittering lineup for the only time What More Can I Give was ever performed in front of a live audience. It would be the last time Michael Jackson ever performed for a stadium audience. Jeff's autobiography, We're Live in 5, My Extraordinary Life in Television, has recently been released and features so many brilliantly told stories. There is an entire chapter dedicated to Jeff's work with Michael Jackson. Whoopi Goldberg once said of Jeff, "Nobody has better stories or more to say." So we're delighted to welcome him to the MJCast today. Jeff Margolis, how are you doing?
Very nice to meet you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm doing great.
That's great. Wonderful. And where are you calling in from today?
Nashville, Tennessee.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Where it's about 81 degrees and very, very cloudy with a giant lightning thunder rainstorm on the way.
Okay, here we go. I must admit, I don't understand Fahrenheit. We use Celsius, so I'm trying to figure out what that is for us. But
it's warm, but it's not uncomfortably hot.
Got it. Well, we are so thrilled for you to be here today, Jeff. I mean, I've got to say, you are somebody that has met and worked with closely with so many different huge stars over the years. So I've got to say, for me, it's even a little bit daunting speaking to you today because of just how involved you have been in show business for so many decades.
Well, just relax. I'm very gettable. You can ask me anything you want. I'll answer to the best of my ability, and we'll do the best we can.
Looking forward. Now, obviously, you've been involved in some of the highlight moments, the most important moments in Michael Jackson's career, whether it be the Sammy Davis Jr. tribute TV special at the end of the 80s, or whether it be famously in 1995, the HBO special. We've got a lot to talk about, but what we like to do with our guests is to orient ourselves in your career. So let's go right back to the beginning. If you could please talk to us a little bit about your early life and where you grew up and your family and all of that sort of thing.
Okay, I was born and raised in Southern California, brought up in Los Angeles, 5 minutes from Hollywood, California. My dad was in the electronics business, and he always wanted to be the first one in the neighborhood to have the newest electronic device. And I remember I was 5 years old, and one night he brought home this wooden box with a piece of glass on the front of it, and he plugged it into the wall, and there were people inside of that box. And I couldn't figure out how they got in there, why they were so small, and if they were going to get out or what was going on. That's where my fascination with television began.
Right.
And it never stopped from that point on. Obviously, TVs got larger and more technically sophisticated. And as the programming developed, so did my taste in television. You know, in the beginning in Southern California, there were three networks. There was CBS, NBC, and ABC. Are you familiar with those networks?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay. Well, those were the three. And then later, there were other syndicated television networks, they were called. Channel 5, 9, 11, and 13 in Los Angeles. 11 was a Metro Media station, which later became and is still Fox today. So there was more and more programming to be offered. And I got interested in everything, and I loved music. When I was 6 years old, I started taking piano lessons because I love music so much.
Mhm.
And anytime there was anything musical on television, I had to watch it. And by the time I got to high school, I had already made the decision that I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew exactly what I wanted to be. And I knew that my dream was to become a television director, producer, and direct the Academy Awards. That was my dream. And I knew that right at the beginning of high school. Now, my problem was I was raised in, like I said, in Los Angeles and Southern California, in a part of the state which was very Jewish, a part of the city which was very Jewish, and most young Jewish men at that time were raised to be doctors and lawyers. Your parents and your grandparents wanted you to be a doctor or a lawyer. So I didn't want to disappoint my family. And although my dream was what I just told you, to one day direct the Oscars, I graduated high school and I got into USC as a pre-med student in the University of Southern California, which is in Los Angeles. And I got in as a pre-med student, and I went, and they were on the semester system then. Semesters were 20 weeks. And after about the first 10 weeks of dissecting frogs and watching things bleed and all that stuff, I just knew that I couldn't do it. So I went to the counselor at USC and I said, "You've got to help me change my major." I wanted to stay at USC because my parents had spent an awful lot of money. It was a very expensive private college. And they paid a lot of money for me for that semester. I didn't want to disappoint them. So I asked the counselor if I could change my major and get into television. She said, "We don't have a television school here at USC. We only have a film school." And so she let me change my major. I got into the film school and I was in there for about 5 weeks, and I realized film is not what I want to do. I want to do television. I liked the immediacy of television. Everything about it just felt right. So, anyway, not enjoying the film school, one day I got in my car and I drove over to UCLA, which was across town. And UCLA had the only television school in the country at that time. You know, I went right up to the dean's office and his secretary. I went in and I introduced myself to her, and she said, you're not going to be able to see the dean. He's very busy. And I said, well, can I wait for him? She said, well, you might be waiting all day. He's got lots of things to do. I said, well, if you don't mind, I'll just sit in the lobby and wait here for him. And, 5 minutes later, he walked in and I got up and I introduced myself and he said, oh, come on in, let's have a chat. And I went and I told him the whole story I just told you about my parents wanting me to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I said, I didn't want to be in film. I wanted to be in television. He said, well, it's a little bit late in the semester. There's only like 5 weeks left. So you're welcome to sit in on any of the classes. And then I like your eagerness to want to be in television and your desire to do the things that you want to do. So I am admitting you for next semester into the television school. So I changed to UCLA. And as I was going to school there the first semester, I wanted to be in television. I wanted to work on a television show. I wanted to be in a studio so I could be around the cameras and the people involved. And, I was hoping to be able to sneak up into the director's booth and watch the director work and all that, which I did. You won't know this name or this show or anything, but there's a very famous game show host. His name was Monty Hall, and he had the #1 hit game show on NBC TV called Let's Make a Deal, which, by the way, is still on the air today.
There you go. Wow.
All these years later. It's not hosted by Monty Hall. He's long since passed. May he rest in peace. But anyway, he liked my enthusiasm. He was a very important part of my family. He was very important to me. And I said to him, look, I'm going to UCLA TV school, but I want to be in it. I want to be in a studio and everything. And can you help me? Can you introduce me to somebody? So Monty Hall introduced me to a gentleman who had a company that did cue cards. So it's when, a singer or a comedian or a host or whoever needs to speak directly to the camera. You hold the cue cards right next to the lens and it's got the script on the cards and you pull the cards, and it's sort of very difficult to figure out how to break the cards down to make it look like the person using the cards is looking directly into the camera lens. And anyway, so I went to work for this guy. And after I worked for him for about 6 months, I realized that he had a monopoly. He was the only company doing cue cards. He had every television show. And I also learned that there were an awful lot of people that were not fond of this guy. He wasn't very good with his scheduling and his billing and all that. And there were a couple of other guys that I was working with who were a little bit disillusioned as well as I was. And so I thought to myself, well, why not start my own cue card company? And I was working on a show called the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Well, Tom and Dick Smothers had a variety show on CBS, and they were two guys who really changed the face of television because they never let the censors say no to them. They did things that had never been done on TV before and booked musical guests that you would never think of being on a television show. And so anyway, I had my own cue card company and I started getting shows and meeting new people. And because I had my own company now, I didn't need to actually work holding cue cards, writing cue cards and holding cue cards all the time. I had enough employees so that I could sit in control rooms and watch directors work and listen to producers talk and see all the goings on. And so I learned an awful lot, and I met two producers who were doing another show called The Andy Williams Show, which is another musical weekly variety show. And one of the producers said to me, we would like you to be the associate director on the show and help us in the editing room. And then shortly thereafter, they were hired by CBS to do a new weekly comedy musical variety show called the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour. So I became the associate director on the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour. And the gentleman who was running CBS, the television network at the time, he sort of discovered Sonny and Cher as television stars. So he used to come in the control room every Friday when we taped the show. And he saw the way I worked. And he knew what my desires were as a director and a producer and all that. And very shortly after, he picked up another weekly variety show called Tony Orlando and Dawn. And Fred Silverman, who was the gentleman who was running CBS at the time, asked me to meet the two producers who were doing that show, two new producers, meet with them because he wanted me to direct the show. So that was my first directing gig, doing a network primetime weekly variety show. That's how I got started, and that was in 1974. I haven't stopped since then. And for years and years and years, I did weekly variety shows, and I also became a specials director. There were more and more specials starting to be done with musical artists. And I became known as a really good music director because if you remember earlier on, I told you how much I loved music and how much it meant to me. And my soul was just full of music all the time. So I was very good at directing it. And, I just had a way of working with talent, whether I was doing an award show and they were movie stars, if it was the Oscars, and they were all movie stars, or if it was the American Music Awards and they were all recording artists, or if it was the Emmy Awards and they were all television artists. I just had a very unique way of working with talent. If you notice in my book, at the end of the book, I have 11 rules of the road instead of 10 rules of the road, which everybody else has. My first rule of the road is to be kind. My fifth rule of the road is to be kind. And my 11th rule of the road is to be kind. And I have that reputation. I have never, ever, ever in my entire career raised my voice or hollered at anybody or lost my cool or embarrassed anybody or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And my job for talent as a producer and a director, or one or the other, is to do the best I can to make them look and sound as good as they possibly can. Now, not all talent is easy to deal with, and they're not all nice people, and they're not all kind. And you have to learn how to work with those people. You try and accommodate them to the best of your ability. When they go crazy on you and start yelling and screaming, what I used to do, usually when an artist yells and screams at you, the director or the producer, it's nothing you've done or anything your stage manager has done or anybody on the crew or anything. It's usually because they're insecure with their performance. They're not getting what they want and they're upset with themselves. And so they take it out on you. Once you understand that, which I did very early on, I just dealt with it. So I always tried to accommodate a star, whether they were nice or difficult. And if somebody really got crazy on me and started yelling and screaming, I would hold my hand up and I would say, "Excuse me, we need to take a 15-minute break. I'll be back in 15 minutes." And I would turn around and walk away, and they'd yell and scream at me as I was walking away, and I'd keep walking. And 15 minutes later, I'd come back and it was like nothing ever happened.
Right.
And you figure out how to solve the problem and make them happy and make them look and sound good and carry on. And every time I produced or directed a show, I surrounded my people who felt the same way I did. I mean, we're all there to make the best product that we can make, do the best job we can. And I surrounded myself with people like that, and they respected me.
I was just reflecting on what you were saying, actually, and thinking about how much that advice could apply to so many of our listeners. Even me, like I'm a school teacher, I'm a head of department in a high school. So I work with a lot of students, I work with a lot of teachers.
Uh-huh.
And just that idea of taking a moment and letting people process, but also perhaps if somebody's acting out a little bit, it's a little bit more about what they're going through rather than what we're going through.
Absolutely right.
That's a great little life lesson there. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when you started talking about how you wanted to first get into television and when your dad brought that TV home,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously I've gone in a very different career path to yourself, but interestingly, coming into the world of Michael Jackson, for me, when I first started to appreciate Michael Jackson, which really was my first appreciation of anything to do with show business,
Mm-hmm.
it was because of my appreciation of these big world television events. I think the first one that I can remember sitting down and watching with my family and loving was the opening ceremony of the 2000 Sydney Olympics.
Right.
And it was shortly after that, less than a year later, that Michael Jackson's 30th anniversary concert in New York City was televised.
Uh-huh.
And I remember sitting on the living room floor with my family to watch it, had very little experience with Michael Jackson before that point, had heard all the rumors, heard the hit songs, all that kind of thing.
Right.
But then as soon as he hit the stage, that's all that mattered.
I know. He's magic. I mean, he was magic.
Just before we get to the first time you met him, and I know you met him when he was younger and coming into the television studio there,
Right.
I'm curious about what your perceptions were of Michael and the Jackson family musically before you got to meet him, because I know you said you were a big appreciator of music.
Well, I mentioned the Andy Williams show to you and the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour and Sonny and Cher and all that, but the first time that I met the Jacksons, I loved their music. I mean, it was different and unique. And I thought their music was like, wow, I'd never heard anything like that. And these five guys were dancing brilliantly and had great harmony and singing together. And they were all related. And I mean, and little Michael, he was 8 years old. They were guests on the Andy Williams show. And we were doing a rehearsal. We were doing camera blocking. And I was holding cue cards at that time. And we finished the rehearsal, and one of the singers of the group came up to me and introduced himself as Michael. And he said, I'm just curious about those cards. How do you know what to put on them and when to pull them and all that? And so I explained everything to him. I explained how I broke the songs down on the cards and when I knew when to pull the cards. And I took him backstage and I showed him where we printed the cards up. And, he said, can I just try holding one of those pens and writing on one of those cards? I said, sure. And so we did the show, and then they were on the Andy Williams show again. And next time, Michael and I, we were already best friends at that point. And then I think I mentioned to you, I moved on to the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour, and the Jacksons were on there. During rehearsal, I was the associate director, I told you, so I wasn't on the stage floor anymore. I was in the control room.
Right.
And we finished the rehearsal of that song, and I walked out on stage, and Michael said, hey, Jeff. And he came up, and, we hugged and all that. And he said, I was looking for you. I said, Michael, I've moved up a notch. I'm the associate director on the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour. He says, you're kidding. He says, well, what do you do now? So I said, come on into the control room and I'll show you. So I took him in there and I explained what everybody did. I mean, it was empty because we were on a break. I showed him where I sat and what I looked at and what my job was and all that. Anyway, we developed this friendship, and over the years, we worked on so many of these shows, and we kept running into one another. After Sonny and Cher, they guested on Tony Orlando, and then Michael started to sort of become a breakout artist. Anyway, we became very friendly. He loved the way that I directed music, and many times he asked me to come in and direct something that he did, even if it was somebody else's show and I wasn't the director. it was all done very hush-hush because I didn't want to take anything away from the director whose show it was. And I always asked if it was okay. Michael and I would go and talk to the producer and director together. And Michael would say, I'd really appreciate it if you'd let Jeff direct this song, which I did a lot. And when Michael had the opportunity, when he was doing something big and spectacular, he always called me. We became so friendly that he would ask me if I wanted to come up to Neverland Ranch and spend a weekend with him and just hang out and talk about, our lives and all that, which I did. And every time we had an opportunity to work together, and then Sammy Davis Jr.'s 60th anniversary came along, and it was one of the biggest shows ever in the history of network primetime television. It was on ABC. And it was a show that ABC bought. It was in the days when they were doing 90-minute specials instead of 60-minute specials.
Right.
And it was purchased as a 90-minute special. And the evening was so brilliant. I shot the show like it was a live show. There were no stops at all. And it lasted for a little over 3 hours. Everything was brilliant. And, the next day, George Schlatter, I don't know if you know that name, famous producer, created a show called Laugh-In. So George Schlatter and I went into ABC and we met with the head of the entertainment division. His name was Bob Iger, who is now, the head of Disney.
Yeah.
Disney, which owns ABC. We met with Bob Iger and another gentleman named John Hamlin, who worked right under Bob Iger. We went in and they said, geez, we were there last night. What a spectacular evening. It'll go down in history as being one of the best evenings ever in television. And we can't wait to see what you've done with the show. And we sat there and with all of the tapes, we had rented this dolly and we put all the 1-inch tapes on the dolly and we went into Bob Iger's office at ABC. He said, I can't wait to see what you've done with the show. And we said, here's 3 hours. We went into an editing room this morning and we don't want to cut anything. So you can look at all 3 hours and you tell us what you want to cut to make a 90-minute show. And he looked at us like, wait a second, we bought a 90-minute show from you. What are you giving us 3 hours for? And we said, look at the evening and tell us what to cut. Enjoy the show and call us when you make a decision. And the next day they called us and they said, you just bought yourself the first 3-hour network primetime television in history.
There you go. Wow.
There it was. There it was. So Michael, he had a writing partner named Buzz Cohan.
Yes.
And Michael wanted to write this song for Sammy, because he really felt that Sammy gave Michael as a young Black artist an opportunity to, he really felt that Sammy opened all these doors for him and people like him, gave them this great opportunity. And he wanted to show appreciation and he wrote this song. And when he got out there and have you watched the performance? Have you seen the performance?
Many, many times. And I've got to say, it is just exquisite. I think it's probably one of, if not the best examples of Michael just singing beautifully live in front of an audience that there is, without any theatrics,
Right.
just him raw as a singer.
Singing his heart out from deep within his soul. He wrote this song and he really believed in what he was writing. And he loved Sammy and he respected Sammy. And he also knew, as we all knew, the public didn't know yet, but we all knew on the show, that Sammy had been diagnosed with throat cancer and didn't have very much longer to live. And I'm sorry, that makes me emotional. Just give me 1 sec.
That's okay.
Anyway, so that was really a one of those special moments in television history that nobody will ever forget.
You talked at length about what he wanted to achieve with the performance, and I think we could all agree he triumphed with that performance. Did you speak to him immediately after it to gauge how he felt about the performance as well? Famously, after Motown 25, for example, Michael even said himself that he went backstage and cried because even though it was a world-changing, brilliant performance, he was unhappy with a very small detail about he jumped up and stood on his toes after the moonwalk and wasn't able to sustain that being on his toes for as long as he wanted. And then he was devastated by that. I've always been curious about the directly after performances, how Michael felt about how they went.
By the way, standing on his toes and being upset about that, nobody in the world knew but him.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, that's what I was talking about earlier about performers' insecurities and things that make them crazy. I mean, everybody thought that he was absolutely brilliant, the moonwalk and standing on his toes and all that. Nobody knew. It's like the very first time I worked with Celine Dion was the very first time she was on live network primetime television, was on the American Music Awards. And she spoke very little English when I first met her. And through an interpreter, I walked with her out onto the stage and I sort of linked arms with her because I wanted to try and make her comfortable because she was shaking like a leaf when she walked out there in the Shrine Auditorium, which is a venue that we shot a lot of these award shows, or we shoot a lot of these award shows at, which holds 6,500 people. And it was built in the 20s, and it's a beautiful sort of Art Deco building. It's just gorgeous. And when you walk out on the stage for the first time, you go, holy shit. And, so I linked arms with her, and her interpreter was standing next to her. And anyway, we got out there, and she was telling me how nervous she was about making a mistake. And I said to her, Celine, if you make a mistake, keep going, because nobody will know you made a mistake except for you. Just keep going. You can't fix it. It's live television. Once it's done, it's done. It's gone. It's over. So don't worry about the mistake you made. Just keep going, and you'll be the only one. I promise you, you'll be the only one that knows you made a mistake. And she gave me a big hug and a kiss, and she said, thank you very much, je t'aime. And every time that I ever worked with her after that, she learned to speak English perfectly, of course. But every time I worked with her, which is 100 times after that, she would hug me and she would say, thank you very much, Jeff, je t'aime. Every time. Was great. I mean, those are the kind of relationships that you cherish. Okay, so you asked me something about Michael Jackson and I got sidetracked.
No, that's okay. It's totally fine. I'm curious about...
Oh, yes, backstage
Yes.
after the performance, yes.
Yeah.
So after Sammy, he wasn't the last act on the show, so I had to stay in the remote truck and finish the show, obviously.
Yeah.
But when the show was over and, the applause died down and everybody started exiting the theater and stuff, I walked out of the truck and I looked for Sammy and I looked for Eddie Murphy and I looked for Goldie. I like to try and get to as many people as I can. Usually the first place I go is to my crew. And I thank like the head cameraman, the head prop guy, and I try and thank as many people as I can. And then I go to the talent. It was like every time I directed the Oscars or produced and directed the Oscars, when it was over, I got on stage as quickly as I could to thank as many members of the crew as I possibly could for a job well done. And then I would go to the governor's ball, the big after party after the Oscars. It was more important to me to thank the people who made me look good and made the show look good and made us all proud. And then I'll go to the party. Sometimes I'll go knock on a dressing room door if I really want to make sure that I see somebody. And I really wanted to make sure that I saw Michael. So he was the first person, after I thanked the crew and everything, he was the first person I went to look for. And he was waiting for me. And I can't remember who was in the dressing room with him, but there was only one other person. And as soon as I walked in, Michael asked that person if he could have a moment. And, we just hugged, and he said, "Oh my God," he said, "I can't tell you what I'm feeling." I said, "You don't have to. I can see it. I can feel it, you know." And he said, "I can't wait to see what you did with it."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, the last camera blocking that we did, I sent it to you, and you were very happy." And I said, "The only difference in what we did then and what was live on the air was your performance. And when Sammy was sitting 25 feet away from you and you kept having the ability to look at him and see his reaction and be in front of 6,500 people. And, there wasn't a dry eye in the house."
Yeah.
And so anyway, we hugged. We probably hugged for a good, 30, 40 seconds and had a little cry. And I said, "I'll see you around the corner, man. Look forward to the next time." He said, "Me too. You'll be hearing from me," which I did, you know.
And I'm guessing that the next time you heard from him may have been for the American Music Awards. That particular award show where he performed the song Dangerous is fascinating because it's the first time, really, I think, in his career that he had done just an all out tour de force, start to finish, heavily choreographed dance number like that, with so many dancers on stage with him. The choreography itself is so intricate. He never performed Dangerous again in the way that he did it on that particular show. There were,
Right,
whenever he did it beyond that, there were like portions of the choreography taken out of it, etc.
right.
Do you remember your conversations leading up to that particular performance around what Michael wanted to achieve with it?
Well, he just said all the things you talked about. It was,
Right.
yeah, it was sort of his biggest performance that he'd ever done on a live television event. He was concerned because he was used to making music videos where he could do 100 takes and all
Mm.
different angles and all that stuff. And I had one shot at it. I think at that time, what did you say the year was? 19?
I believe it was 93.
Yeah, so at that time, I probably had maybe 12 or 13 cameras to shoot the American Music Awards, which all of these music award shows on the air now have 24, 25 cameras to shoot the show.
Mm.
It's like in the early days of television, I used to shoot these weekly variety shows with 4 cameras. And now the directors that go in and shoot these weekly shows like America's Got Talent, Simon Cowell, shows like that and American Idol and all those other shows. I mean, those directors have 16, 17, 18 cameras on a 1-hour weekly variety show. So with 13 or 14 cameras, whatever I had then, it was much more of a challenge to try and shoot a highly choreographed number live, no second takes, no redos, no nothing. So Michael Jackson was on the American Music Awards numerous times. And, every time he was on, we'd hug and kiss. And I'm so glad you're here. And, have you heard this song? And I said, "Michael, I've heard everything that you've done." And, every new song I get, especially around American Music Awards time, I get it before it's even released to the public. And I see your videos before anybody else sees them and all of that. So, Yes, tell me if there's anything special you'd like me to be aware of. He said, you know what? I trust you. He said, why don't you camera block the number the way you want? And the last camera blocking, if you would just tape it for me so I could look at it. I said, fine. If you want me to make any changes and do anything differently, please ask and I will accommodate. And 98% of the time, he never asked me to fix or change or make any adjustments at all. He was always happy. I always got hugged and kissed and hugged. And, we had that kind of relationship. I mean, I understood him and he respected what I did. Michael and I had lots of discussions. He had two choreographers that were his main choreographers that did almost everything with him.
Mm-hmm.
Their names were Travis and Lavelle.
Yes.
There was another choreographer who was involved, and he was a very secret, sort of special choreographer. His name was Jeffrey Daniels.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite a challenge, and Michael had Travis and Lavelle do drawings of where people were going to be during certain lyrics of the song to make sure that I didn't miss anything. And, we had worked together so many times, and they would make suggestions on Michael's behalf about when they wanted to, or Michael wanted to make sure that I was on a head to toe shot of him alone and not to worry about the dancers. They were just icing on the cake at that point.
Mm-hmm.
They really weren't part of what he was trying to get across musically. So I would get little hints like that. We would discuss things like that, which I kind of knew anyway. I knew Michael so well, and I knew the lyrics of his songs so well. And I sort of knew when to be on a close-up and when to be on a head-to-toe shot and when to be wide on the whole stage. And, as a director on these live shows and all the talent that I worked with, I always told them this. I always put myself as the director, fifth row center in the auditorium or the venue. I put myself fifth row center, and I try and show the TV audience at home what they would be seeing if they were sitting in the theater watching the performance. That's a pretty good philosophy to have. There were lots of drawings and lots of discussions, and I took everything and listened to everything, and like I always did. And we did it. We did it. It was big and it was dangerous, and it was as exciting for me as it was for him,
Yeah.
believe me. Challenges like that for a director are really, they're exciting, they're challenging. And if you care about what you do the way I care about what I do, it means a lot to you to do it and get it right, get it the best it can be done.
Yeah.
Show the millions and millions of people who are watching what they turned on to see, and most importantly, make the talent happy.
Now, was Michael as happy with that performance as he was with the Sammy Davis Jr. performance?
Totally different performances. One was emotional and heartfelt and meaningful, and the other one was a brilliantly written song, choreographed brilliantly, very exciting, out there, joyous. Two totally different things. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Now, directly after the American Music Awards, a horrific thing happened in Michael Jackson's life, in that he was accused of horrible things. And obviously, we at the MJCast are big supporters of his innocence, that there is no evidence really to point to his guilt. What I'm curious about is, in these years between when you worked on the American Music Awards and then came back to do HBO's One Night Only with Michael, these allegations about child sex abuse broke. And at the time, do you remember what your immediate thoughts were when you had heard that, especially having spent time at Neverland and seeing the philanthropy?
Right. First of all, the HBO One Night Only special was done and conceived to sort of these were after the allegations.
Hmm.
Michael, the record company and his management company and his legal people, everybody wanted him to make a comeback like, no, I'm not guilty. Here I am doing another performance, which is what I love to do. That's kind of what it was all about.
Can you recall any specific conversations with Michael around his vision for what he wanted this show to be and what you wanted this show to be?
Yes, we talked quite a bit about it before we ever even got to New York. Many weekends I went out to his home in the Santa Clarita Valley, Neverland. We talked a lot about how he wanted to appear to his fans and how he wanted to appear to the audience. And we both really wanted to do something different and special for him. And we talked about how he could remain the king of pop and be Michael Jackson, but add a little something new, a little twist, give the audience, like years earlier when he introduced the moonwalk, that was like the biggest thing. And he wanted to find something like that to do again on the show. And we talked a lot about the types of music that he wanted to do, the new songs that he wanted to introduce for the first time, and the oldies but goodies that he wanted to do. We talked about, the intimacy of making an evening where he became like a real touchable guy, a real touchable guy that you could identify with. And Michael wanted this HBO One Night Only special to be really just that, one night only, and the most special thing that he had ever done. And he and I kind of came up with an idea together. I said to him, Michael, you're untouchable. You perform in these venues that hold 80,000 people, 50,000 people, 30,000 people. And most of the people who pay to watch you on these giant video screens, they really don't get to see you. When you're in the nosebleed section and you look like an ant on the stage there, people really don't get to see you. They get to see whatever the director who's directing the screens puts in the screens. A lot of our conversations were very personal about a lot of he was going through a lot of stuff at the time. I was a good listener and I was a good older brother, so to speak, and
Hmm.
listened. And so we talked a lot about that. But as far as the show was concerned, we wanted it to be terrific for him, something, and this is hard to understand, but something so that everybody would know that it was Michael Jackson, but there would be a little different flavor to it.
Mm.
We always said to each other, everything old is new again, but new is new. And yeah, we talked about things that we could possibly do. One of the things that he said was that all these shows that are always done, even if it's a one person concert, they usually have a guest or two come on. If it's like a Dolly Parton, she'll have somebody come on and sing a duet with her, or Justin Timberlake, or whoever it was at the time. He said, what if we did the show with only one guest? And he said, I have somebody in mind, and it's somebody that a lot of people won't even know who it is. But I think it will be spectacular. So we talked about that, and he told me his idea, and I thought it was brilliant. And, that's what we ended up doing. He only had one guest on the show. Do you remember who it was?
I'm assuming you're talking about Marcel Marceau, the French performer. Yes.
That is correct. Michael loved him. He was the greatest pantomime artist in the world. Michael loved pantomime. He knew Marcel. He had met Marcel. That's all he wanted. He didn't want to sing with anybody. He didn't want to dance with anybody but the dancers. And we talked a lot about that and how we would present Marcel Marceau and how the two of them would perform together and what would make it the most special performance of any entertainment special ever on television. Well, we both wanted this to be the best entertainment special that had ever been done. And then on top of that, Michael wanted every part of this great special to be even more special than anything else, you know. But that's one of the things I loved about him. He was so creative and so inventive and always wanted to be remembered for doing something new and different and something that he created or invented, like the moonwalk and all those things.
Yeah.
So it was kind of fabulous putting the thing together and spending the time with him and talking creatively. And those are what our discussions were about. How were we going to involve the audience in the theater or the arena, wherever we decided to do the show at the time? How we were going to make certain that the audience at home watching it on television felt like they were in the room with Michael in the theater with all the people. And, Michael, everything needed to be bigger and better than the last thing he did and bigger and better than anything anybody else had ever done. So those are really what the discussions were about.
Great.
A lot of good creative energy went into those talks. I said to him, why don't we do something intimate? Let's do something where you're not untouchable, you're touchable. Let's find a theater. I mean, we can do the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, 6,500 seats. The famous Pantages Theatre in Hollywood, which I don't remember how many seats that is. I think it's about 4,200 seats, excuse me. The Pantages Theatre, which holds about 4,200 seats. And Michael said, I really would like to get out of Los Angeles and get away from the paparazzi there and where all of these allegations have taken place and all that. So I said, okay. I said, there's a great theater in Atlanta, Georgia. That's a perfect kind of an Art Deco place. And I said, there's always New York. There's Radio City Music Hall. You don't want to go to Madison Square Garden because that's too big. There's Radio City Music Hall. I said, on the Upper West Side of New York, there's the Beacon Theater, and it holds about 3,500 people. It's an intimate theater. And no, I think it's about 2,500 people, if I'm not mistaken. And I said, it's very well known as an entertainment venue for Black artists. And I said, nobody would ever expect you to be at the Beacon Theater. Nobody'd ever expect you to perform any place that small. And I said, let's talk about that. And he said, I like that idea. And he said, I was sort of thinking along the same lines. He said, but I like the idea of the Beacon Theater. And he said, the most difficult thing is going to be to sell that idea to the record company, my management company. And I knew Michael's manager for 100 years. He was an old friend. Michael said to them, I want Jeff to produce and direct it. And they said, fine. So after I left this discussion with Michael, I said, let me get started with your manager. His manager's name was Sandy Gallen. He had two managers, Sandy and Jim. So I said, let me talk to Sandy and Jim and just sort of tell them what our idea is. So I went and I met with them and they said, no fucking way, get out. When you come back with a better idea, come back and talk to us. No fucking way is he going to perform for 2,500 people in a small theater on the Upper West Side of New York. Well, guess what? That's where the show was to be done. So Michael went to New York for 6 months to rehearse for that show. He wanted it to be different He wanted it to be something that nobody ever would expect that he would do. He wanted to spend the proper amount of time doing different types of choreography and doing things differently. Okay, so we talked and talked and talked. And I made a suggestion to him. I said, you do most of your stuff with Travis and Lavelle, and I love them, and I think they should be part of this. I said, why don't we bring in some other choreographers? And I said, give a choreographer a number to do or 2 numbers to do. Let Travis and Lavelle do a certain amount of numbers. And I said to Michael, you know Kenny Ortega, let's bring Kenny in. And Debbie Allen, who's another good friend and a friend of Michael's, I said, let's bring Debbie in. Let her choreograph a number 2. And I said, there's a new kid in town named Jamie King, who's really good, and another new kid named Barry Lather. And I said, let's give them a number. And then there was this Australian girl that we found when we went searching. Her name, I think, was Morley Steinberg, if I remember correctly. So I brought all these choreographers in, and we decided which numbers each one would do, how many numbers they would do. And they came in at different periods of time. That's why Michael wanted 6 months.
Right.
Because he was working with all these new choreographers. He had a musical director named Brad Buxer.
Mm-hmm.
And before Michael started rehearsing anything, he and Brad recorded all the music in Los Angeles. And Michael had everything on tracks. So he could rehearse to the actual stuff that was going to be done live. When we did One Night Only, all the music was going to be done live. But at least Michael had the same exact musical tracks to rehearse with. Same tracks that he rehearsed with was the way the music was going to be played, exactly the same way live on the night.
Do you know if those tracks included orchestral components?
Oh yeah, they were all full tilt boogie. You know, they were whatever the arrangement was that Michael and Brad wanted it to be. As a matter of fact, I remember, oh God, there's so much to remember about this show, that Brad came to New York and he put together an orchestra in New York, and he re-recorded some of the music. Because of the choreography, Michael had to make some changes, so the music had to be redone. I never wanted to know what the budget was on that show because everybody had a blank check, and I didn't want to take advantage of anything, but I wanted to accommodate Michael to the best of my ability in every way, shape, and form. So Michael was there for 6 months, and he said to me, I would love for you to be in New York with me. And I said, I can't go to New York for 6 months. I've got a lot of other obligations here. And I said, I have 2 young kids at home. I have a wife and 2 young kids. I'm not leaving them. So he said, well, how long could you come to New York for? I said, I'll come for 2 months, but you have to let me go home every other weekend to see my family. And he said, let me think about that. And he came back to me and he said, how about 4 months? And you can go home every other weekend. And I said, okay, 3 months it is, halfway between. That was the arrangement we made.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I went to New York. The first time it was the weekend came up for me to go home. I stayed for the first 2 weeks in New York, and then I wanted to go home that weekend. I got in the limo to go to the airport, and the phone rang. And it was Michael, and he said, do you really have to go home? We're right in the middle of, and I really need your input, and I need you to be here. And maybe, can't you maybe go home next weekend? And I said, Michael, don't start. I said, I've been on this train before. Don't start. We made a deal. He said, yeah, but. I said, no yeah buts. I said, I'm on my way to the airport. I'm going home to be with my family. I'll be back on Monday. Call me as much as you want with any questions you have. I'll be happy to answer. And there was no FaceTime or Zoom back then, so it was just on the phone. Anyway, so I spent a lot of time in New York with him. And then I did something that, wasn't normally done. And I booked us more time in the Beacon Theater. Those places are so expensive to rent, those theaters, that you usually can't afford to go into them for more than about 2 weeks, to put the set up and get all the equipment in. And then you usually get to camera block on those 3-hour live award shows, for example. You usually get to camera block for 5 days. And then the 6th day, you're usually live on the air. But this HBO One Night Only special was a 2-hour special. We still got the 5 days to camera block, and we were in there for like a month because Michael wanted to rehearse on the stage. He wanted to get his bearings and all that.
So let's talk specifically about what this show was going to look like. And this is going to be hard to do, I guess, because each song would have had a very different feel. I mean, there's material out there talking about the song Dangerous having a very Clockwork Orange kind of feel. And you just described the Marcel Marceau childhood performance, which I think famously has been described as Michael, singing, and then Marcel bringing to life what Michael was talking about.
Right.
Or singing about.
Right.
And I'm hoping you can talk to us about some of these songs and what the detail of them were going to be in terms of which ones stand out to you looking back on it in terms of what they were visually going to be and how different they were going to be from what we'd seen before.
That's a good question. We didn't want a show that was about the scenery on stage. We wanted a show that was about Michael and the dancers and the choreography and the music and the musicians. So the set was very beautiful, but very simple. And there was an orchestra on stage, upstage center. And then Michael's band was, half of it was stage right and half of it was stage left. And it was a mixture of Michael's sort of pop rock and roll band and this Philharmonic orchestra that we had on stage. And the lighting designer did a brilliant job of being able to highlight whatever music was important for that particular number. And, he didn't do costume change for every song. He was going to stay in the same look for a lot of the show because, that was part of the intimacy that we wanted to create and the closeness that he wanted the audience to feel. The way I shot the thing is I put myself in the 5th row center of the theater. And I shot the show as if I were seeing it through my own eyes in the 5th row center. So there was a lot of really good creative camera work, but it wasn't a gimmicky. It wasn't unreal. It wasn't, it felt like when you watch the, some of the rehearsal tapes, which we were able to see, it actually felt like you were really in the room. You were there with him. And, I followed him around. And when I felt that it was important to see his entire body when he was moving, I stayed. I did a whole number, so I don't remember which song it was, but I did a whole number on one camera. It was a big crane camera, and we started on a high wide shot in the theater across the audience, and the camera came down and zoomed into Michael on the stage, and then slowly, as he started singing and dancing, camera moved into like a full body shot, a head to toe shot, and followed him for 3.5 minutes.
Wow.
And at the end of the song, the camera zoomed right back out to where it started on this high wide shot across the audience looking at the stage. And I never cut away. And it was kind of brilliant on both of our parts. I mean, he did it perfectly, and I thought it was such a good directorial decision to try and do something like that. And one of the other discussions Michael and I had about choreography was, he loved Fred Astaire and he loved Gene Kelly, and so we watched a lot of those movies together and how those guys danced, and both of them directed many of the films that they were in, and watched how a dancer choreographer turned director directed himself. The basic set was the basic set, and anytime anything looked different, it was done with lighting somehow,
Right.
or a star drop in the background that made Michael look like he was floating in space, or something like that. But it was one basic set. We didn't want scenery flying in and out and walls rolling in and out and all that. We didn't want to take. This show was called Michael Jackson One Night Only, and that's what it was going to be. Michael Jackson One Night Only. You were never going to see this again. You've never seen anything like it. You never will. And this was his moment to shine.
It sounds like such an incredible vision and a huge point of difference to the rest of his career, really. Because, like you said earlier, when you watch Michael concerts, there's, 80,000 people in the stadium. There's, you described watching it from the nosebleed section and him looking tiny on stage, and you'd have to see it through the big jumbo screens. This,
Right.
that's what a lot of his performances were like. This would have been completely different. So, in terms of those things that you talked about earlier with the song with the single camera shot and those kind of things, how deep into the rehearsal process did you guys get? And were you able to capture this on film when you were doing all the camera blocking and those kind of things?
Yes. And Michael and I decided that I would never tell him exactly what I was going to do. The only thing that we talked about in detail was the Marcel Marceau number. But everything else, Michael had the confidence in me as a director to capture everything he did in the right way. And I had the confidence in myself and in Michael that as a team, we were going to make brilliance, which we did. I never said to him, when you do this number, you need to stay in the center of the stage because blah, 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 blah. There was none of those kind of conversations. Or you can't go too far off stage right or too far off stage left. Or there were none of those conversations. He had complete freedom to be Michael Jackson, who he was, how he felt in the moment, performing.
How far into the rehearsals did you guys get? Was it as far as dress rehearsals?
Yes, we were just starting to do our first dress rehearsal. We had planned on doing 2 full dress rehearsals in one day. And then the following day, we were going to do another dress rehearsal with an audience and then do the live show on HBO.
Right.
And so this was the first day, the first dress rehearsal on the first day without an audience. And that's when, he collapsed and it all happened. And
Yeah.
oh my God.
So let's talk a bit about that. How far into the show did Michael start to exhibit signs of something was not right?
I would say maybe 15, 20 minutes. I started to, I was sitting in the remote truck directing, and my AD, who was my assistant director, who was a friend of mine, was sitting next to me, and Michael's manager was sitting behind me. And he finished the number, and I turned around to the manager, I said, "Is he okay? I mean, he's starting to look a little bit off." And Jim Morey was the gentleman's name who was managing Michael, one of the nicest guys on the planet. What a great man Jim Morey is. he said, as far as I know, he's fine. He said, but I see what you're feeling. And then, within moments after that is when it happened. Something was just off. Something was just off. This kid always had a smile on his face. He was always, when he was on that stage, he was always in performance mode. He was at the top of his game whenever he was out there performing, whenever he was on camera. Something was just off. And I knew him well enough and had worked with him long enough and knew, the quirks and all that. And something wasn't right. Anyway, you can see when somebody's starting to, haven't you been in a meeting? Haven't you been in a meeting? And you see somebody starting to nod off or something.
Oh,
yeah. So that's kind of what it was like.
Right. Now, I've spoken to a range of people who were there in the moment on the stage when this was happening, and there's very conflicted, accounts. Some people say, oh, he kind of keeled over and other people say, no, he fell flat on his face, like fell over. So I'm sort of wanting to go straight to the source here. What did you witness in terms of his collapse? Was it a dramatic fall onto the stage, or?
He was dancing and I thought he had tripped, and because he sort of fell to his knees and then he just dropped flat on his face.
Wow.
He kind of fell to his knees and then he must have blacked out, momentarily for seconds. But between his bodyguard and the security guards and everybody, I mean, as soon as he dropped to his knees, those guys were at the ready. And by the time his face hit the floor, they were out there all over him.
Right.
It was pretty frightening. And he fell on, Michael always used to have those grates on the front of the stage, those grates, so because the fans would blow up through the grates and, all the confetti and stuff would always come up through there, all his special effects. And he fell right on top of one of those grates, smashed his nose.
Oh, God.
And and he was wearing sunglasses and the glass was all cracked and that was terrible.
That really sounds horrific. So I can imagine it would have been a scene of pandemonium. Did you run out of the truck and straight in there, or what happened then?
Well, Jim Morey was out of there so quickly, and I was the closest one to a phone after Michael fell and I saw what was going on. I stayed in the truck and called 911.
Right.
Then I went out on stage and, he was so surrounded by all security and his bodyguards and, all that. So, I mean, it happened so quickly.
Yeah.
And they got in there and they put him on a gurney and they hooked him up to, however many different machines. And he was out of there in that ambulance on the way to the hospital so fast. I never saw anything like it.
Mm-hmm.
Very frightening.
And so how soon after that were you in touch with him?
I didn't speak to him probably for a week and a half.
Yeah.
After that time.
Right.
Yeah, I had to take care of, I knew that the show was never going to be complete. I knew that I had to pull the plug, let everybody know, tell everybody what was going on and all that. I tried to get a hold of Michael. His doctor had flown in from Los Angeles, and I don't even think Jim Morey, his manager, could get to him. Nobody was allowed to go anywhere near the hospital. And he had a really terrific bodyguard named Wayne.
Yeah.
And Wayne was really good about always answering his cell phone and returning texts and all that. So we sort of communicated through Wayne.
Yeah.
But nobody ever got to go to the hospital to see him.
But what was this like for you? Because you had described earlier to me that you had spent 4 to 6 months in New York City working with Michael on this production before it happened, before it didn't happen.
Right.
And then in this moment when he'd collapsed, then a week went by with you deciding that it wasn't going to happen. What was this like for you? This must have been devastating.
It was devastating. Well, I knew by the end of that day, this happened, I'm trying to remember about what time it happened in the afternoon. It probably happened somewhere between 2 and 4 o'clock, I would say. By the time the sun went down, I was told by Jim Morey, who had been talking to Wayne, Michael's bodyguard, there was no way that Michael was going to recover and be able to come back.
Right.
There was no way. So I was devastated. The amount of time that we spent creating this show and designing it and putting all the elements together musically and choreography, and it was unbelievable. There were so many people involved with this show, so many people who loved and really cared about Michael, knew how special this show was going to be, how important it was to him. And they just wanted to be there for him and do the best job they possibly could. And I had to gather everybody that night, the same night. I gathered everybody in the theater. We were at the Beacon Theater. I gathered everybody in the audience, and I sat on the lip of the stage with my stage manager and my assistant director and Jim Morey. I had to tell everybody, what was going on and that I had to pull the plug. The show wasn't going to happen. And I get very emotional when I talk about this, so you have to forgive me for a minute.
It's okay. I fully understand.
But I had to tell everybody, and I started to cry. I was so heartbroken. I was so sad for Michael and scared for his health and his situation. And that was the most important to everybody. We just wanted him to be okay. But, to be sitting there with a couple hundred people who've been working their asses off and have to tell them that they could all go back to the hotel and pack and go home because it wasn't going to happen. It was really tough. It was really tough. Forgive me. I'm sorry. To this day, I still get emotional about it.
Yeah.
It was so devastating, but I'm sorry.
Please don't apologize. These are the real stories that Michael's fans don't necessarily know.
Yeah. There were a lot of tears and a lot of hugs, and a lot of kissing, and everybody was very supportive. Is there anything we can do? We don't have to pack up and go home tomorrow. And I said, unfortunately, you do, because now that I've pulled the plug, HBO has to pull the plug. That means there's no more money.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't quite like that, but I was trying to make a point.
It's absolutely, I'm trying to think of the right word, eerie maybe, I'm not sure, but it's an echo of something that was to happen much, much later, obviously, in Michael's life, where Kenny Ortega tells a very similar story of when Michael had unfortunately and tragically passed away in preparation for the This Is It tour, had to gather the crew, on the floor of the Staples Center and tell them what had happened. When I hear the story of HBO, it feels just like I guess sort of like an echo of something that was going to come later. Like a near miss maybe, I'm not sure, but it's just shocking to hear about. And in your book, you have this wonderful section in it, which is raw and real. And it's talking about, I just want to read this bit out to our audience to set the scene. And I really hope people go and grab this book. It is fantastic reading, incredible insights into your brilliant career. For those that want to pick it up, it's called We're Live in 5, My Extraordinary Life in Television by Jeff Margolis.
Thank you.
Now, this is getting to the heart of your relationship with Michael. It says, but at some point, the conversation always turned into a discussion about his life and his problems. I was not only his good friend, producer, and director, but I became his therapist, a role I was not equipped to play, nor did I want to. Finally, I said, Michael, I'm only responding to your questions because we're friends. I'm like an older brother to you, and I'm only telling you what I know and I feel. I'm not a doctor. You really need to speak to somebody about your issues. He said, my father always taught us that only sick people go to doctors. And I said to him, Michael, let me tell you something with love. I wanted to say to him, you're sick and you do need help, but I didn't. Instead, I told him, it would be good for you to see a doctor, a really good therapist. You could use some help. I felt comfortable enough with him to be totally honest, and I wanted to be helpful. That's the kind of relationship we had. And one last section in it says, one of the problems was that while we were working together in New York, he was physically not well. He wasn't eating properly and he was much too thin, obvious signs of stress. He was pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion, chasing perfection. He kept getting weaker and weaker and he wasn't sleeping. I said to him, Michael, you're not going to make it through this if you don't start taking better care of yourself. His bodyguard, Wayne, was trying to do everything he could to keep Michael healthy, but you can't force Michael to do anything he doesn't want to do. So now that I've read that bit out, I want to go back and ask you, when this collapse happened, how surprised were you?
I was really surprised because he is not a quitter. You know, I've worked with him numerous times when he's hurt himself in the middle of a performance and he keeps going until he's done. You know, I mean, he just doesn't quit. I was shocked. I was shocked.
And when these conversations were happening, when you were concerned about Michael's health, was Michael acknowledging that there was an issue?
No. He would always say to me, don't worry about me, I'm fine. You know, I have plenty of chicken soup from the deli down the street. and, and he loved, I don't remember what they were called. He used to like these candy things that he would chew on, like gummy bears or something like that. And he said, I get plenty of sugar and I get protein from the chicken noodle soup or whatever kind of soup I have, and I'm fine. And he said, I'm just working really hard. You know, it's stressful, and this is the way I show it. So I said, well, I'm worried about you. I want to make sure that, you know, you're good and strong and healthy. And this is a big deal for you, especially, but for all of us.
Yeah.
We want this to be one night only and the greatest night in entertainment television. By the way, I'm so sorry I left Kenny Ortega out of the mix. He was also on the stage with me when I had to tell everybody what was going on. I brought Kenny Ortega in to work with us because I'd worked with Kenny numerous times, and I loved his energy and his creativity and his excitement, and I knew how much he loved Michael Jackson. I sort of brought him in to oversee the choreographers. He worked with Debbie Allen, who was also a friend of Michael's and a friend of mine. Debbie wasn't there because she was in a movie or doing something, so she wasn't there when all this was going on. But Kenny was there, and he was right by my side, you know, all the time. From the time we moved into the rehearsal studios in downtown Manhattan to the Beacon Theater, Kenny was always there and very supportive. And I didn't mention him enough of how involved he was and how helpful he was and how supportive he was to both me and Michael.
Understood. There's an interesting quote from Lavelle Smith Jr. where he talks about how Billie Jean was apparently going to be quite different. And Smith said, I remembered them trying to get him to do that. But why? They were trying to get him to change everything from his dance routines to his hair. Michael was smart. He would have done whatever he wanted in the end. If the new numbers weren't ready, he would just say, okay, let's go to the classic. And people want to see him do the classics. Even if the new stuff is really good, they're going to miss the classics. So I guess I wanted to ask, there's Michael talking about wanting to make things different. There's Lavelle questioning why they had to be so different. But also saying that there was some kind of plan where Michael, if he wanted to, could just click his fingers and make the performances the old way. Was there a backup plan for some of the songs to be done the old way if the new ways weren't working out?
Well, if you had seen the show, Michael Jackson's music is Michael Jackson's music. There's a style that he had that nobody else has.
Hmm.
There was a feel to his music. And if he was trying something new and he felt uncomfortable doing it, we didn't have to change anything musically. He could just step back into that old familiar sort of pattern and nobody would even notice. They would think, oh, geez, he tried something new at the beginning of the song and now he's going back to show us that, it's an oldie but goodie, and you wouldn't have known.
It's always been a question, I guess, in fans' minds, because nobody's really seen it. So it's always been a question in fans' minds, how new were all of these songs? There's mention of Beat It looking very different with like trench coats and flashlights and a very kind of like Spy 007 kind of feel. Would have been really something.
Yeah. Each choreographer tried to come up with a different kind of a look from the video that Michael had made of that particular song. None of us wanted any one of Michael's songs to look like any one of the videos that he had done that had been on MTV and VH1 and everything forever.
Right.
So we were all trying to do something different looks-wise. Michael's songs were classics, and that's what the people wanted to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So why change the musical arrangements? The song is the song. Billie Jean is Billie Jean, and Beat It is Beat It. You don't want to change it musically, but what you can change is the look and the feel of it. You can change the choreography. You can change the costumes. You can change the sets, but we didn't have any set changes.
Yeah.
But you can do sort of cosmetic surgery, we call it.
Mm-hmm.
Where you leave the main thing as is, and as they say, zhuzh it up. Right.
Right. You mentioned a while ago when we were talking that there was an orchestra behind his band. You also said that Burt Bacharach was working with Michael and this orchestra to compose this music for a long time before the rehearsals. Do you know if there's a recording that exists of these songs with the orchestra behind them?
I think that in case of an emergency, if I remember correctly, they pre-recorded everything, all the music, just to have as backup. Even though it was all going to be done live, they pre-recorded the music to have it done as backup. So somewhere, somebody has something on tape of Michael singing with the orchestra and the band and, whatever arrangement he and Brad put together. And I don't know where those things are.
That is incredibly exciting to hear as a fan, because if there's one thing that Michael never did that a lot of people wish he did were, orchestral versions of his songs. You always hear about, artists doing a show with an orchestra, or their hits or whatever. It would be incredible if that existed for Michael. So to hear that there is a recording out there of this is very, very cool.
Yeah, somebody has it. To hear these classic Michael Jackson tunes the way that you always heard them, but add a 40-piece orchestra on top of it, and these classical great musicians, these Philharmonic musicians playing Michael Jackson music on their basses and violins and violas, and it's pretty exciting. It's really exciting.
Yeah, that's incredible to hear. Very, very cool.
Yeah.
All right. So just as we wrap the HBO section of our discussion in particular, one more, I guess, difficult or challenging question maybe. When you look at Michael's life, especially in the last 15 years of his life, last 10 years of his life, there was a pattern of Michael putting himself in situations where he didn't have to do a show. So you've got Michael working with Marcel Avram for the Millennium concerts. He was going to do 2 concerts, one in Hawaii, one in Sydney, and famously cancelled those. And Marcel sued Michael because of that, actually. And then later on, also on the record, is Michael almost not doing his 30th anniversary special in New York City. David Guest produced that one. And the night of the show, a few hours before he was meant to perform, Michael was found in his hotel room by his assistants, really in a bad way, very, very under the influence of heavy medication. And they had to get him out on stage. And David, in his book, describes the first of the 2 shows being a total mess because Michael was basically completely high for the entire first show.
Right.
You talked about his anxieties that you spoke with him about. Do you think that there's any chance whatsoever that Michael used this collapse situation to not do the show?
That's a rough question for me to answer, but can you stop recording for a minute?
I can. I've never done this before,
pause
but
it?
I can press pause. I've never done that, but I'm going to give it a try. Okay. Listeners, it was at this point of the conversation that Jeff requested to go off the record due to the sensitive nature of the topic. His response around why he felt the collapse happened was insightful, but unfortunately, he would not give us permission to include it in the episode. Jeff also requested to go off the record when I asked him about the extent to which Michael's rehearsals were filmed and what still exists of that footage. Let's get back to the interview. All right, so even though there was not a good ending to the HBO story, you did get to work with Michael again. And that was after the tragic terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001 in New York City. And this is the United We Stand concert in Washington. Tell me the whole story of that. Whose idea was it to put this show together?
It was all Michael's idea. I think Michael was so upset by what had happened, and so it just got to him somehow, and he wanted to do something to give back to the families of the people who were lost in that tragic event. He wanted to do something special, and he wanted to do something special to show the world that the United States of America was standing strong. And he was such an emotional, good human being, sensitive, good, caring guy. He just wanted to do something. And I think he probably mentioned it to his team, somebody on his team. And he said, I want to move very quickly and I want to get it done now. The next thing I knew, I was on a plane flying to Washington, D.C. He was very emotional about this thing. He really wanted it to be something special, something that people would remember. And he wanted the world to know that we were all so hurt by this tragic event that happened, and that we were caring, loving people who wanted to do the best we could to comfort all those who lost loved ones. And that's the kind of guy he was.
Yeah.
I think it was his idea, and I think that once he quickly started talking to his team about it and said, I want to do this and I want to do it yesterday, I think they just really went to work and made it happen quickly.
What is the production process like for a show of that scale? Because in this particular concert, you have got dozens and dozens of artists, from Mariah Carey to all kinds of people performing on this. Are there the same kind of rehearsal timelines, or how does this work in terms of getting it together?
A lot of the artists never had an opportunity to rehearse. They came, and when they performed in front of this gigantic crowd of people, it was the first time they got on stage, and it was the first time they were doing. I mean, that was their rehearsal, is what was going on the air, because These big shows, they take 4 to 6 months to put together. You can't put one of them together in 4 to 6 weeks and expect to get what you would get if you spent the proper amount of time and energy, and you know what I'm saying? But
Yeah.
we figured out a way to do it. We knew that we didn't have very much time, that it was Michael Jackson. It needed to be special. And we worked around the clock. We worked 24/7 around the clock, getting this thing together, booking talent, booking private planes, hotels, booking everything for everybody. All of the performers, they all gave their talent and their time. Nobody asked to be paid for anything. They all showed up when they were supposed to be there, and they performed the way they were supposed to perform. And it was it was a spectacular evening.
Yeah.
It all came from Michael's heart.
And was he with you when all of this was going on, the scheduling and the discussions around it all? Was it via phone, or was he with you physically in Washington?
He was not with me. It was all, we talked on the phone. We were on the phone all day long.
All day. Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
so when you can actually watch this show, like it was televised. I believe it might be on YouTube. The thing is, though, that when you get to Michael's section, it's not. You can't see that. There's only the thing that you can see is the what. So we did two songs. I think it was "Man in the Mirror" and "What More Can I Give." And "What More Can I Give," famously, it's funny because you can't see any close-ups of Michael. It's all like wide shots of him. And for a long time, fans have speculated that maybe that's because there was some kind of contractual issue or obligation or something with another competing network where you weren't allowed to show close-ups of him. Is that the case?
That is absolutely correct. He wasn't allowed to be on camera.
Right.
And that's what contractually it was. He could not be on camera on this show. And somehow we negotiated with the two networks that were involved, and they agreed to let it be known that he was on stage, but I could not shoot him performing. I could not take a shot of him. I could never establish that Michael Jackson was on that stage with those people performing. That's why you never saw him. And for me, as a director, I thought, oh my God, I'd never shoot anything like this.
Yeah.
I'd rather not have those songs on the show. But Michael he wanted everybody to know that he was part of it and he wanted to be involved. And I mean, you don't see him at all in the finale. The finale was so beautiful with all those artists on stage. And I couldn't take a shot of Michael. The interesting thing is that when I was shooting it, I shot it like I normally would have as a director, a Michael Jackson performance.
Yeah.
And it was when I was in the editing room a couple of days after we did this thing that Michael's attorneys walked in with the network's attorneys, and they pulled me out and we had a meeting and they told me everything. They said, you gotta somehow edit him out of the show.
Well, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you. I was curious to what extent there was existing footage of Michael performing Man in the Mirror and his new song like he always would have been shot. And you're saying that footage does exist.
It did. I'm sure it doesn't any longer, but it did. But I'll tell you something. I isolated most of the cameras so that I could edit this thing together and cut it down to time and all that.
Right.
And every tape of every camera that had a shot of Michael Jackson was taken out of the editing room that I was working in, the editing studio that I was working in, so that I didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice. They took all the tapes that had all of Michael's performance on it, and they left me wide shots across the audience, big reverse shots.
Goodness.
And stuff.
Oh, that must have been infuriating for you.
Oh gosh, I would never, ever, ever, ever direct anything like that. But Michael wanted to be on the show. He wanted people to know that he was there. He understood that contractually, he didn't want to get sued. He already had enough lawsuit shit going on.
Yeah.
And he didn't want any more. And so I was embarrassed, because I would never shoot anything like that. But again, it was another one of those emotional things. Michael was so into this. It was so important to him. And
Yeah.
it was such a tough time for Americans and all that. So anyway, I did what I had to do.
He certainly brought a lot of people together for that concert. Really great.
Yes.
Was that the last time that you had much to do with Michael? Did you ever have conversations with him after that?
Oh, yeah. We spoke all the time. I continued to, every once in a while, I'd go out to Neverland and we'd either go for a full day, or sometimes he would say, why don't you just, we're both night owls. Why don't you just stay in the guest house down the road? And, that way you don't have to rush back to Los Angeles and all that. Because it was about he's about 2 hours outside of the city.
Mm-hmm.
No, we stayed in touch. We talked about a lot of things, and we talked about, I spoke to Kenny Ortega a lot too, and I know what he and Kenny were going through. And at one point, Michael asked me if I wanted to be involved with them, and I had so many prior commitments that I couldn't do it. I said, I hope you understand. He said, I understand. No, we kept in touch till the very end. I didn't speak to him probably, maybe, last time I spoke to him maybe was about 3 months before he passed.
Wow. And what sort of things would you guys generally chat about?
Oh, just gossip, Hollywood showbiz shit, who was doing what, and did this performer really deserve this award at the Grammys, and all that kind of stuff. We were buddies, we were friends,
Yeah.
But he loved the entertainment industry. He loved showbiz, and he loved to talk about it. So
Great.
that's what I talked to him about.
Can you tell me a bit about your recollections of Neverland Ranch? You said you'd stayed there a bunch of times.
Yes.
What did you think of the property?
It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. When you drove in through those gates, you thought that you were driving into the most magical place on earth. He sort of reconstructed the same exact look as Disneyland in Anaheim, California, as the original Disneyland. He constructed the same look. The first time I drove on, I thought, wait a second, where am I? Am I at Disneyland? Anyway, the property was so well maintained, always beautiful flowers and greenery and pristine everything. It was like a dream. It was like a dream. It's Neverland, Neverland, where dreams come true. It was absolutely spectacular. And he had everything. And everything you wanted, anytime you wanted. He had the petting zoo for kids. He had a movie theater for kids. He had a little hospital that he built for sick kids so they could come, a hospital built around a movie screen so that he could come and show sick kids. They could come with their doctors or nurse practitioners or whatever and have all the equipment they needed there, like a little mini hospital built around a big screen. And it was incredible. And, all the times I told you I went out to Neverland and we just hung out for a weekend and talked about us and his life and my life and the difference between the way he was brought up and the way I was brought up and those kind of things. We really, really became friendly.
What was it like hanging out at Neverland with him? Aside from those conversations, what did you guys actually get up to? Did you explore the grounds with him much at all and those kind of things? And
oh, yes. Every time I went up there, he had something new. One time I went up there and he had a little zoo. And the next time I went up there, and he expanded the zoo into 10 times the size it originally was. And, he had a little home theater. One time I went up there, and, it was very comfortable, cushy lounge chairs, giant screen, Lucas sound system and all that. And then I went up a couple months later, and he had an actual theater, with 100 seats in it, and twice the size of the screen, and a sound system like you would not believe. And, it was always something like that. And he collected Disney memorabilia anytime he could get anything from the Disney company, from a movie. Or, Neverland also was designed after Peter Pan. And, the whole Peter Pan concept, and where time stands still, and there was always something new and interesting. And he was so philanthropic. He used to, on a weekly basis or every other week, he lived in a place called Los Olivos, which is right near Santa Barbara in Northern California. He used to invite classrooms from schools around the area in Northern California. On a Friday afternoon, he would invite a classroom to have lunch, and he would always do something special for the kids, like have a clown that made balloon blow up things, or an artist. And then he would have the kids go to the zoo. He had a zookeeper, and he would show the kids all the animals, and some of the animals they could touch and some they couldn't. And then he'd always end up the day for the kids by showing them a movie. And it was usually a Disney movie. And he was that kind of guy. He was so philanthropic and so loving and kind and generous and brilliant, I might add. I mean, brilliant, musically brilliant. Quincy Jones is a very dear friend of mine who I speak to probably once a month. I just spoke to him the other night. But Quincy and Michael got together, and they did those 3 albums, which were, Michael's best-selling albums. And Quincy's another brilliant genius. As a matter of fact, I produced one of the Oscar telecasts that I did. Quincy and I produced it together, and I directed it.
Right.
I think it was 1996. Did that show? I'm not sure. Anyway, so Michael was a generous, kind man. And all those accusations that were made toward him about being a pedophile and stuff, I couldn't stand that. My heart broke for him, because none of that shit was true. He was just so kind and generous. He loved kids. And look, his childhood was stolen from him. That song he did, Have You Seen My Childhood?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
He was just a very giving, loving person. And he did miss his childhood, because starting at 6 or 7 years old, he was part of the Jackson 5. They had a brutal father who was a real taskmaster and worked those kids to the bone. Michael didn't have much of a childhood, and for a while he was homeschooled. And then after a while, he was so popular, he couldn't go back to a, public school. And so had to be privately educated. So anyway, his childhood really was stolen from him.
Did you ever get the chance to watch anything in the theater with Michael?
Yes. Yes, he loved anything Disney. Anything Disney. And we went into one of his many theaters on the property, one of the smaller theaters. He wanted to show me that he had a copy of the very first artist sketch animation that Walt Disney himself did. That, I'm sure you've seen it, where Mickey Mouse is on the ship whistling.
Oh, yeah, Steamboat Willie.
Steamboat Willie. Yeah.
There you
That
go.
was the first thing Michael sat down and wanted to show me. But he had every Disney movie that was ever made, he had there.
My last question for you, Jeff, is a question we ask every guest, every special guest we have on the MJCast, and that is, how do you think Michael Jackson should be remembered?
As a loving, kind, beautiful human being who had creativity and talent beyond compare, had compassion for people, was very philanthropical to help people all over the world, especially children. He was an amazing guy. I've never met anybody like him in my life. He was an amazing guy, very complicated guy, but not really. I mean, he was special. They broke the mold. They broke the mold after Michael. He was a good friend, a loving, kind, generous man. I cared so much for him, and he felt the same about me. We had a really strong, good friendship. I can't say anything unkind about this guy. I have not one negative thing to say about him. He certainly enriched my life. Just knowing him and being part of his family and his universe and sharing with his desire and passion. I'm probably repeating myself now, but I just,
It's all right.
I can't say enough wonderful things about this guy.
I love that. I love it. Thank you so much for your thoughts, Jeff. And also, I just want to say a big thank you for giving us so much of your time. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful hearing about your journey in the entertainment industry and also the incredible value that you were able to bring Michael to elevate his work to a whole new level. And I just want to give another shout out to your book for listeners who want to go and grab that. We're Live in 5 by Jeff Margolis. Really great read. Wonderful stuff.
Okay.
Well, Jeff, this has been really great. I might just take a moment giving listeners information on where we can be found if they'd like to connect with us online. The MJCast is on all the different social networks, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Blue Sky, all over the place. We're also on email. If people would like to give us feedback on this episode or any other episode, you can reach us at themjcast@icloud.com. We would love to hear from you. Obviously, we are a podcast, so you can subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on YouTube if you'd like to subscribe there. And we'd love it if you could rate and review our show, particularly on Apple Podcasts. If you could give us a star rating and a review, that would be super duper appreciated. Thank you. Well, thank you again so much, Jeff, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've loved speaking with you and hearing your story. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I love speaking with you. I mean, you did a really good job. You asked all the right questions. You listened, you paid attention, you responded. I'm very impressed with you. Thank you so much for having me. And if you ever want me back for anything, give me a call. I'll be there for you.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff.